Let's jump right into the specs. The Nikon D500, listed at about $2,000, is an APS-C camera that features a 20.9 megapixel sensor. It also includes 153 focusing squares, 99 of which are cross-type, and shoots at a blistering 10 frames per second with a buffer depth of 200 consecutive raw images when using the XQD memory card slot. It also has an SD card slot for backup. It includes a tilting, somewhat touch functional monitor, 4K video with a flat profile, and tons of other great features. I am super impressed with the D500. I have a lot of cameras that come and go, and it is one of the cameras I cannot get rid of. At the time of this recording, bang for your buck sport shooting camera, I think it's the best. I think it's the very best out there, and I don't say that lightly. Fujifilm's X-T2 is a mirrorless wonder. Not only is the construction of the camera itself very retro, old school, incredible craftsmanship, it's really beautiful, but underneath the hood we're seeing some very impressive things, including a 24 megapixel X-Trans sensor. The X-Trans sensors are different than Bayer sensors in terms of how they handle moire, color fringing, sharpness, things of that nature. Some believe that at APS-C, it is as good as full frame. So it's a very special sensor. It too has incredible focusing systems, including 325 focus points, 169 of which are phase sensitive, and it can shoot anywhere from 5 to 14 frames per second, depending on whether or not you are shooting electronic shutter or if you have a battery grip. It too features 4K video, Wi-Fi. You can use the tilt screen monitor, which also tilts sideways for portrait shots, and it is a joy to use. The X-T2 to me stands out in its image look. It looks different. There's something about that X-Trans sensor that makes it say, hey, this is different and special. Really a true pleasure to shoot with the X-T2. If you haven't tried one, I would definitely recommend at least renting it to see if it's something that whets your appetite. Also, let me say that I have no affiliation to Nikon or Fuji. I purchased these cameras with my own money, and you'll be also happy to know that I know them very well, inside and out. I have created crash course videos for both of them, so if you are a new Nikon D500 or X-T2 owner and you're struggling to learn your camera, I can definitely help you out. I'll put the links in the description as well as at the end of the video. My epic shootouts are intended to be unbiased and informative. I'm trying to present to you the very best data that you can find on the internet about them if you're considering purchasing one or the other. I'm trying to do it through things that I can show, demonstrate, measure with numbers. I'll even let you pick side-by-side portraits so you know which look you like better. I'm not trying to convince you to buy the camera. My job is to provide you with the information that will let you come to your own conclusion. Many of you have asked about the lenses used in these tests. On the Nikon, it's the 24-70 2.8 non-image stabilized version. On the Fuji side, I'm using the 16-55 2.8. I typically like to try to have them to be the same focal length ranges. It's going to be a little bit difficult to manage that during the sport shooting. I'm just going to shoot normally as I would. On the portrait stuff and some of the other things, I can kind of get equivalent focal lengths, and that's what I'll try to do. Just know I try to use the best lenses from each manufacturer on the camera to give us an idea of what we're shooting with. Typically, I like to start with the focusing systems, so let's go down to the park and see how they do for sport shooting. A few interesting notes right off the bat. The battery performance is significantly better on the Nikon, with a listed average of 1,240 shots per battery charge. The X-T2 battery is rated for about 340 shots per charge, and they cost about $70 each. So if you're planning on shooting over 1,000 shots in a day, be ready to spend another $140 on batteries. In this case, the D500 has a huge advantage on battery life. Second important note, Fuji makes a battery grip that will hold 2 additional batteries and increase your mechanical frames per second from 8 to 11. There's also a 14 frames per second mode, but this is an electronic shutter and we won't be testing it in this example. I'll be using the battery grip and shooting at 11 frames per second. The third important note is I usually test the furthest left or right focusing squares in our servo tests. As soon as you switch the X-T2 to continuous focusing, we lose the outer focusing squares and are limited to the more sensitive phase detection squares. Covers about 1/2 of the viewfinder. Comparing that with the D500, we get edge-to-edge coverage, including cross-type focusing squares. That is a huge advantage for the D500 if you shoot with your whole viewfinder. Fourth little side note is that the X-T2 has several focusing tweaks that you will need to make sure are correct if you want to get maximum performance. I did several preliminary tests for coming and going action and found that a single square, not the smallest but the next biggest, with scenario 1, boost performance on, was best. I also tested the zone focusing cluster, which is probably more handy for birds in flight. I had more misses with it in the pre-tests as well as with other scenarios, so this is why I made the decision I did for single square, scenario 1. For side-to-side motion of a moving subject in good light, the Nikon D500 scored an 87%, with the Fuji X-T2 scoring a near-perfect 99%. For a subject moving towards the camera in good front light, the D500 scored 89% and the X-T2 scored 78%. For a subject moving away into strong backlight, the D500 scored a 77%, with the X-T2 scoring an astonishing 91%. While both cameras performed very well, the X-T2 stands out with a total average of 89%. It also performed very well in heavy backlight, which is the Achilles heel of mirrorless cameras. In terms of accuracy only, it is one of the best sports focusing cameras I have ever tested. That said, the Nikon D500 is right at its heels with an overall score of 84%. A camera's buffer performance is how many shots it can take before the camera begins to slow down physically or turn off. We're going to do both tests. First, we're going to try RAW, and then we'll try JPEG only. So first off is the Nikon D500. Count of 3. 1, 2, 3. $200. So it stops right at 200 if you're shooting on RAW. Let's take a look at the X-T2. Count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh. Not many. Probably 25, 30 tops. Let's try JPEG jagged or JPEG normal. We should be able to get a lot more than the RAW. Ready, go. I think it's 200 also. That's interesting. So it sounds like we're getting far greater performance out of the D500. It's not even a contest. So let's try, just out of curiosity, we're going to go normal JPEG, not even fine JPEG. We're going to go with normal JPEG, see if we can get some better shots of the X-T2. Ready, go. It's starting to slow down. All right, buffer performance, no contest. D500 is the winner. Very interesting results for our sports test, but I'm ready to declare a winner. While the X-T2 is lighter and has slightly more accurate focusing systems, I'm declaring the Nikon D500 as the winner in the sports test. The coverage, the incredible buffer, and the ergonomics give it the win. It is my #1 sports shooting camera at the time of this recording, and I recommend it to all heavy sports shooters. That said, the Fuji X-T2 has proven to be a very formidable sports shooter. While it wouldn't be my first choice for a sporting event, it is more than sufficient to shoot most types of sports action if you are willing to set it up correctly. Just keep in mind, it is going to be limited on coverage and buffer depth. We did several tests with both cameras to find out which was best for tracking a moving subject during live view, as well as which is better for video recording. The D500's touchscreen works great for video and stills, and it is a pleasure to use. I think the X-T2 could really benefit from getting a touchscreen in the next future model. The X-T2 does have eye detection, which is awesome. It doesn't work half the time and not at all in video mode, which is not awesome. The D500 has a face detection mode for video. It works. The problem with it in the other tracking modes is it breathes too much. You get this jumpy look in the video. The X-T2 has a continuous focusing mode in square for video, which is much smoother. While I typically shoot with manual focus for video, I have to give the video focusing mode win to the X-T2 only because it is a little smoother. The D500 just jumps too much when focusing for video. In my low-light focusing test, I had two high-contrast targets, one at 6 EV and the other at -2 EV. I focused back and forth for 30 repetitions using the center focusing square of both cameras and repeated the tests several times. The Nikon D500 scored an average of 49 seconds, with the Fuji X-T2 scoring an average of 36 seconds. For low-light focusing without using an autofocus assist lamp, the Fuji X-T2 is better in low light. It's important to note that the Fuji X-T2 has an X-trans sensor. This is fundamentally different than a traditional Bayer sensor, and therefore, different RAW converters are going to treat X-trans generated files differently. You're hearing this right. You are going to get different results depending on the converter that you're using, whether it's in camera, whether it's Lightroom, whether it's something else that somebody else made. It really depends on what you're using, so take this with a grain of salt. I'm using the camera's in-camera RAW processor to create the JPEGs, and we're going to look at the JPEGs here now on these color charts. For the most part, I see noise grain performance as being very comparable up to 3200. Once we get to 6400, we start to see more grain on the Nikon, but I believe the X-T2 suppresses this with over-softening. That is the trade-off. Both cameras are very usable up to 12,800, but beyond that, we run into heavy grain on the Nikon and over-softening issues on the Fuji. Extreme ISO tests on charts are one thing, but what about real-world shooting situations with lower ISOs? One test I like to perform is an ISO sharpness test using a model. At an ISO of 400, the X-T2 seems to have a distinct advantage when comparing side by side. I saw this over and over and over again in the tests. The X-T2 just looks sharper. That said, the D500 looks pretty good. As we increase our ISO, say to 3200, both cameras start to lose sharpness. I believe what is happening here is the processor is softening up the noise grain, and by 6400, both cameras are showing much softer images, but the X-T2 has a very distinct advantage at higher ISOs when it comes to sharpness. Now, obviously, there's many things in play here, but the experience that I have had with the X-T2 so far is that the images, time and again, are consistently sharper across the ISO range. Let's talk about some of the video features. Both cameras record 4K UHD video, which is a resolution of 3,840 pixels by 2,160. But the way they get there is different. The Nikon D500 uses a much smaller part of its sensor, which equates to about a 2.2x crop factor compared to full frame. This is smaller than Micro Four Thirds. The Fuji X-T2 oversamples using a larger part of its sensor, about 1.17x of a 1.5x crop sensor, to give it a full frame equivalent of about 1.7x when shooting 4K. So in other words, the X-T2 records at 6K resolution, which is then reprocessed and exported out at 4K. On other cameras that do this, the result tends to be a much cleaner image. Now there's some more useful information about some of my tests. Bitrate performance on the D500 was 120 megabits per second for 4K and about 40 megabits per second for 1080 at 60 frames per second. The X-T2's 4K video was about 100 megabits per second and about 81 megabits per second for 1080 at 60 frames per second. Let's take a look at some basic side-by-side video footage. I like to shoot at 4K and present in 1080 because of the compositional options it gives me. This is how I shoot professionally, and this is how I shot for the test. Side by side, at full view, it is difficult to see significant differences, but when we punch in at 100%, one of the two really stands out to me in terms of image, sharpness, and clarity. I cannot exactly determine what is causing this, whether it's the sensor, the oversampling, or even the lens, but the clarity and the sharpness of the X-T2 stands out on close inspection. I also perform a number of high ISO tests, both with candles and color charts. On the candle tests, there wasn't a huge difference up to ISO 3200. At 6400, I see a touch more grain on the D500, and at 12,800, I see a bigger advantage for the X-T2, but to be honest, it really isn't that much, maybe a third or a half stop. The D500's ISO goes to 1.6 million, and in all honesty, it really isn't going to be usable past 64 or 12,800. Very comparable in both cameras up to those points. Same thing with the color charts. 3200, very comparable. 6400, we're starting to see some slight differences, probably the limit for both of them. And what I look for in these higher ISOs is how the pixels dance with certain colors. Rolling shutter is a jello-like effect we see when we pan left or right. Vertical objects, such as this light stand, become wavy when panning. On the D500 at 4K, we see a moderate amount of jello, even when panning very slowly. The same is true at 1080 60 frames per second. It isn't as bad as I've seen in other cameras, but it's not really good either. 4K on the X-T2 is very impressive. It is one of the best I have seen in a long time. Minimal jello effect, also at 1080 60 frames per second. I have to give the win here to the X-T2 on rolling shutter. Moire is a splotchy artifact that we see in certain patterns such as my horizontally lined shirt. As a side note, neither camera has an optical low-pass filter. These filters are supposed to help reduce moire at the cost of sharpness. Traditionally, Nikons have tested very well with moire. And again, the D500 has a little bit of moire, but it's not that bad. I was disappointed to see stronger moire in the X-T2. The concept of the X-Trans sensor is to help break this artifact up, but in the case of my shirt, the D500 is the clear winner. Recording 4K video often requires a huge workload for the processors, which in turn can really make the cameras hot, and in some cases even shut down. After 20 minutes of 4K video recording, the Nikon D500 registered a temperature of 109 degrees Fahrenheit. The Fuji X-T2 came in even hotter at 112 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep this in mind if you are doing a lot of 4K video recording. These cameras are both going to get very hot. In the case of video performance, I'm ready to declare a winner. The D500 records a beautiful 4K image. There's no question about it. Its moire performance appears better, and its high ISO is on par with the X-T2. All that said, for its wider crop factor, its oversampling at 6K, for its image clarity, rolling shutter performance, the X-T2 would be my preferred choice for video. I would just be a little bit nervous about the chance of moire popping up. For my dynamic range test, I fire a strobe through a Stouffer wedge, which is essentially 41 little ND filters at 1/3 stop increments, or about 13.7 stops of total dynamic range. I overexpose the first part of the strip to calibrate and then analyze using camera raw. I'm basically looking for the last interval that has a distinct and complete border. The full methodology is outlined in detail on my blog. While this technique is not great for measuring total dynamic range, it can give us some really important insights when comparing two cameras with the same exact settings in the same lighting conditions. Both cameras are showing impressive dynamic range. At an ISO of 100, I would call it on the X-T2 between 36 and 37, and on the D500 at about 37 and 38. I'm also persuaded that the D500 has a grain advantage at ISO 100 if you look in the deep blacks. At an ISO of 3200, I believe the X-T2 has a slight advantage scoring between 33 and 34, with the D500 scoring between 31 and 32, maybe 30 and 31. In terms of a winner, it will depend on the ISO that you're using and what your grain tolerance is, but suffice it to say they're both really, really good. Super impressive. How good are they? Well, compare them to the brand new 5D Mark IV, a full frame camera that has excellent dynamic range at ISO 100. All three cameras are right there. They're playing on similar playing field, and that is saying tons about the D500 and the X-T2 because they are smaller APS-C sized sensors. Grab a pen and a piece of paper and list it from 1 to 12 and write down whether you like the left image, A, or the right image, B, more. Pause the video if you need some extra time. Don't think about it too much, just look at the images, follow your gut instinct. This has been very popular to determine which image quality you will prefer more for portraits. One side note I need to make is that when I do these tests, I try to get all the settings and apertures and focal lengths to as close as identical as possible. And what I learned is that the Fuji underexposes about 1/3 to 1/2 stop compared to the D500. It was immediately noticeable in all of my shots as soon as I imported them. In this particular epic shootout, I made the executive decision to slightly adjust the exposure in post to give you a closer exposure comparison. In real life, you would just adjust the camera settings, but I didn't want to do that in side-to-side shooting. This is something I just wanted you guys to be aware of. No other changes were made. I used auto white balance in the standard picture profiles for both, trying to capture different models in different lighting conditions, including shade, bright sunlight, backlight, and different ISO settings, things of that nature. So just go through the test, write them down, and I'll give you the answers at the end. So are you ready for the answers? Here they are. Score which camera you liked more, and that will give you a really good indication of which image quality you prefer for portraits. So these epic shootouts take 4 to 6 weeks. They take a lot of time and a lot of work, and I always get questions about why didn't you test this or why didn't you test that? I'm trying to focus on the most important differences, and so if we see a feature in both cameras that work equally well, a lot of times I won't really talk about them or do them like multiple exposure mode or interval timer mode. And a lot of these little features I don't talk about, they are there. If I missed some of your favorite features, list them in the comments below. I'm always open to hearing from you guys. But there are a few points that I definitely need to make that you guys need to be aware of. Both cameras are Wi-Fi capable. So they have apps that you can download. The problem with it is, as of this recording, the D500's iPhone app does not work. I have not been able to connect. Some people have. I've tried many times. I cannot get that app to work on my iPhone. Hopefully there will be an update soon. The X-T2's app is working for me. It's a little quirky, but it does what I need it to do, and it's totally functional. I actually kind of like that app a little bit. Another super important note that you guys definitely need to be aware of is that the Fuji has something called an X-Trans sensor. X-Trans sensors are different from CMOS sensors in the pattern of the photo site layout. And I've already done a video on this. I'll put a link in the description if you guys want to learn more about the X-Trans sensor. But suffice it to say, the irregular pattern makes it appear more film-like. So if you did the portrait test and the overwhelming majority were in the favor of the X-T2, that might have something to do with it. All that said, you need to know that the raw processors for the raw files on the X-T2, they give different results. And I've done a lot of research on this. It really deserves its own video. And I'll put some information in the description. Hopefully in the future we can do one. But the thing is, is it's such a different layout that you're going to get different results depending on which of these RAW processors you're using. I use the Lightroom or the Camera Raw to process the RAW images, and it's actually not the best one for the Fuji. You will probably have better results with some of the other processors. Hopefully, it'll improve in the future. But as a disclaimer, I felt I needed to say that we looked at the JPEGs coming out of the camera a lot of the time, but there were some RAW tests that we did and RAW files we did, so I needed to point that out. So, in conclusion, which camera would I recommend to what kind of photographer? And which camera would I choose if I could only pick one of them? Two really good questions. If you are a sports photographer, I think you have to go with the D500. The coverage in terms of the focusing squares, edge to edge, the incredible buffer depth, the ergonomics, I love the grip, the joystick on the back is amazing. The battery life, far more shots, and the number of zoom or telephoto lenses available for native focusing, they all point to a winner for a sports shooting camera. The D500 could do lots of other types of photography very well, including landscape, portraits, anything of that nature, general shooting. The video features are more than capable. I was very pleased with the 4K video coming out of it. I've done some sunset shoots with it. Very polished, all-around, wonderful camera. In terms of an APS-C sized sensor in a DSLR camera, it's the best I've seen. And I think we're looking at the APS-C DSLR camera of the year in the D500. It is that good. X-T2. The things that really stand out to me far and above are, number one, the image sharpness. If you are a sharpness freak, this is your camera. And there are a lot of videos that need to be done about the ecosystem between the sensor itself and the available lenses. There's not as many lenses available, but they are very high quality. And I'll take quality over quantity any day. I've been shooting with it for about 2 months. I'm still really intrigued with it. Another thing that really stood out to me were the video features. This typically isn't a strong point for Fuji cameras, my understanding is, but they have done a tremendous job. The 4K video, in terms of the oversampling, I thought it looked sharper and cleaner. The ISO performance was right there with the D500. The rolling shutter was among the best I've ever seen in a video hybrid camera like this. The one negative was the moire on the video, but still, I definitely believe, look at peaking, some of these other options it has. This is a great 4K video camera. I prefer this for video because I love having sharp eyes on portraits. This is the camera I would choose for portraits and video shooting. I think it does landscape great. Again, you're going to see that sharpness. If you haven't tried the Fuji X-T2, I would strongly recommend it. Fuji is coming on really strong. I think Sony is going to have their hands full competing with Fuji. Fuji, you're doing an amazing job. Look at the camera body and the craftsmanship that went into this. This is a very solid, rugged camera body. The manual controls, it's a work of art. This is a beautiful camera. And they're selling out everywhere. And pretty much everybody I know that's tried one, they don't go back. So if I had to choose a camera between these two, I love my D500. I would choose the X-T2 for the reasons I've talked about, sharpness and the overall performance. I'm very intrigued with it to this day. So that is my epic shootout. I want to say thank you guys so much for your support over the years. Because you have shared and liked these videos, I keep on making them, and as long as you continue to do so, I definitely will. Let me know in the comments below which cameras you would like to see in my next epic shootout. I am Michael the Maven. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you own either the Fuji X-T2 or the Nikon D500 and are struggling to learn them, I have excellent crash courses on both cameras. I'll not only teach you how to operate them, I will show you how to take great images. They come with a 100% money-back guarantee, and you can order them from the following link.